Thank you so much for being here. Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2012 Leon Forrest Lecture. You'll hear more about the naming of the Forrest Lecture and Professor Forrest's significance in the fields of African American studies and in our department and at the university at large in a moment. But as chair of the Department of African American Studies, I first have the distinct pleasure of introducing and acknowledging our university president, President Morton Shapiro, who is here. Welcome. Our provost, Dan Linzer, who you'll hear from in a moment, who is also here. The Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Sarah Mangelsdorf, who you heard from yesterday, but you'll hear from again today. We're excited to have you here. Thank you. And we have two additional deans here, Dean Toni Marie Montgomery, who is the Dean of the Music School, the Beanan School of Music here at Northwestern, and of course, our very own Dean Dwight McBride, who is also here. And it's really a pleasure to welcome and acknowledge Mrs. Forrest, who is here in the audience. And I also, this will embarrass them mightily, but since she's in the room, I would love us to give a round of applause to Suzette DeNost and Marjorie McDonald, who have been here and done a phenomenal job. Phenomenal work organizing this conference. As many of you know, I had a baby about a month ago, and people have asked me, how are you here with a child? And he's upstairs with my mother, and I said 2 words, Suzette and Marjorie. So thank you so much for making this such a phenomenal event. And I also have the pleasure of introducing my colleagues in the Department of African American Studies. When I came here in 2002, and actually Dean McBride and I were reminiscing just earlier, we were hired the same year, and it was, as you heard yesterday, there were 3 faculty in the department, and now we're at 15. And Dwight, as you all know, as chair, was extremely instrumental in building this department. And then the leadership was adopted by Richard Eiton and Darlene Clark-Hine and then myself. So we have a very long tradition of great leadership in the department. Mary Patillo and Sandra Richards have also served as chairs. And I just really think it's important that we recognize the group effort that it took to bring this department to the place that it is today. So I want all of my colleagues to stand in the Department of African American Studies. I see Tracy Vaughn is here, E. Patrick Johnson, Alex Swahili, Sherwin Bryant, Alden Morris, Sandra Richards. We really are a phenomenal team, and our department boasts 4 endowed professorships. And we also have the Leon Forrest professor, who is Alden Morris. So we are really excited about the work of the department. And if I could just ask our students to stand, because really, you all are the reason that we're here. We have a graduate program. Our 20 graduate students are here. If you all could stand. So our conference theme is the beautiful struggle. And as we celebrate the department, and we celebrate Black Studies at large, and we celebrate the 11 departments that currently offer doctorates in African American Studies, we've been having an ongoing conversation about the importance of a partnership between departments and university leaders. And we're really excited that we have a very strong partnership here. So it's really my pleasure to introduce the person that was extremely instrumental in that process. You met Dean Mangelsdorf yesterday, but I want to introduce you to the other person who was very instrumental in that process, and that was the provost, Dan Linzer, who was the dean when many of us were hired, and who was very involved in giving us the support and the resources to build the department to where it is today. And I consider, and I'm not just bragging, our department is, I believe, one of the crown jewels of the university. So I thank Dan Linzer for his support, and I welcome him to the podium to welcome you.
Well, thank you, Celeste. I was asked to welcome you, but as this is day 2 of the conference, and I was asked to welcome you to Northwestern, but as this is the Orrington Hotel, I don't know. I hope you're enjoying yourselves. So, and Sarah talked yesterday about what happened in 2002, but I'll give you my, maybe this is revisionist, but my history of a memory of that and see if it squares with what Sarah told you. But there were a few of you in the room who were there as well, because this was a meeting with Mary and Alden, and I think the third person was Bob Gooding-Williams at the time. Is Bob here? I had just been named dean, incoming dean, so this is February of 2002, and I wasn't going to start until July. And we had a meeting on the potential recruitment of a new chair of African American Studies into a department that Mary was holding together with Scotch tape because there wasn't much there to do with the department. So Mary and Sandra were pretty much the core of the department at the time. And a decision really had to be made of is the institution going to make a commitment to build African American studies, or is this enterprise not going to go forward? And of course, the individual in question who was being recruited was Dwight. And all of you know Dwight. He did not have small plans. So if we were going to recruit Dwight, I remember that even for a humanities professor, a long letter of all the things that would have to be addressed to make this work. And I had just been named dean. I'm a scientist. I hadn't come from this area. It's like, what are you talking about? This was amazing to me. So we had this meeting, and a bit of the history of the department and its fits and starts and what it was trying to accomplish was discussed. And it was clear that that was the moment. We are either going to make this happen or it was going to fall apart. And while Celeste very kindly gave me some credit for that, it was really my predecessor as dean, Eric Sundquist, and my predecessor as provost, Larry Dumas, who said they wanted to work together to make this happen and commit the resources to add the faculty positions to grow the department successfully and address the other 12 pages of Dwight's letter. So they made it happen, and they turned to me and said, "What do you think?" I was like, "Well, sure. This sounds great." This might have been one of the very first meetings around the time that I was just named as dean, so I had no idea how to put this into scale of all the other things that were being done. But it was clear as I became more knowledgeable about the kinds of commitments that get made to build academic enterprises, that was a really special moment in Northwestern's history, because commitments of that magnitude just don't happen every day. So why did it happen, and what has it meant for Northwestern? Well, it happened in large part because of a fundamental belief that my two predecessors had, as well as the other faculty involved, in what African American studies would bring not just to the college, but to the university as a vibrant enterprise. And that was an inherently interdisciplinary field of study that connected to so many other important areas, and that fit perfectly into the culture that we thought we had and that we wanted to expand, which was a culture of collaboration that dealt with big issues and tackled some tough issues that might lead to uncomfortable conversations. And AFAM was perfectly situated to achieve that. And indeed, Dwight's vision in running the department, as you are all aware, is to create a department that I believe to this day has the largest number of budgetary joint appointments of any department at the university, compared to departments that are many, many times larger than AFAM. So it is a department that cares about AFAM and history, and anthropology, and English, and performance studies, and sociology, and political science, and. And that is the epitome of the kind of networking of academics that we were trying to achieve through all these other ways at the university, but AFAM was ready, poised to achieve it from the start. It also was ready to offer a curriculum that would deepen student experience and faculty teaching in a critically important area. Because when we talk about creating a university that changes people's lives and gives them experiences that matter, the only way that's really going to happen is if the students who come here encounter ideas, encounter people different from them that challenge their assumptions. And AFAM was well poised to do that. What happened since in the 10 years is, I think, just spectacular. That Darlene arrived and helped create the Center for African American History, a strong partnership with the Department of History. We've had many other important partnerships that have really thrived. Richard took the lead in writing the proposal for the PhD program, which we launched now 6 years ago. This is 6 years ago. And it's been steadily more and more exciting. So I'm thrilled to see this. I was thrilled to see the article in the Chronicle. It's nice to see the field recognized and the visibility this has brought to Northwestern and to Black studies generally across the United States. And I am delighted that you've all come here to Northwestern, or close to Northwestern, to have this discussion about graduate education and how far this field has come. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. It seems like what I found in the archives and what you actually experienced were very similar. Our recollection of what's happened to African American studies over the last 10 years here at Northwestern. I want to welcome Professor Jonathan Holloway, who I'll explain in a minute, really stepped in at the last minute. And it's great to see Marianne Forrest sitting right in the second row. For those of you who weren't here when I did some opening remarks yesterday, I want to welcome you all here sort of to Northwestern. And as Celeste said, I'm Dean of Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, which is the proud home of the Department of African American Studies. And I want to welcome you to our 13th annual Leon Forrest Lectureship. In a tribute to Leon Forrest's excellent scholarship and his dedication to his students and his literary success, the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences established this lectureship in 1999. Through this lectureship, the African American Studies program invites noted artists and academics to campus to celebrate the memory of Leon Forrest and explore African American literature and culture. Past Leon Forrest lecturers have included Pulitzer and Nobel Prize-winning author Toni Morrison, actor Danny Glover, author Jamaica Kincaid, and most recently, Professor Henry Louis Gates. Now, Professor Leon Forrest was not only a beloved professor at Northwestern for 24 years, he was also among the most innovative and ambitious African American fiction writers of the 20th century. His books fuse classical mythology, realism, and African American history and culture. Professor Forrest's legacy endures through his short stories and novels, through the students he taught, and of course, through events like this that honor him. It is always a treat to look out into the audience, and this year, because it's coupled with the conference, we have a particularly large audience, which is wonderful. And thank you all for coming. I know you'll enjoy this lecture. As many of you know, Elizabeth Alexander was originally scheduled to give this lecture, but suffered a death in her family last week. We are so honored to have Professor Jonathan Holloway, Elizabeth's close colleague, with us today to present The Trauma of Legitimacy, Black Scholars in Memory in the Age of Black Scholars. At this time, I present, this is funny, Celeste presents me, I present Celeste. I present Celeste, who I don't need to tell you, is the chairperson of the African American Studies Department at Northwestern University, to make Professor Holloway's introduction.
Thank you so much. And before I introduce Jonathan, to Dan's point about interdisciplinarity, I also see a lot of our affiliated faculty in the audience. If you all could just stand, these are faculty members who do work in the field of African American Studies and are throughout the university. And I just want to acknowledge and thank you for being here. It's good to see you all. People make sense of race on a daily basis, crafting judgments and conclusions that often travel beyond racial boundaries and yet are imbued with racial meanings. As such, race is a powerful translator of complex ideological constructions, simplifying them by masking them in the guise of common sense and appearance. Race offers tantalizing, if frequently pernicious, shortcuts to social thinking. I am certainly not the first to acknowledge this problem, nor am I the first to seek its resolution. Jonathan Holloway eloquently frames the conundrum of race and uses his scholarship to explore how Black intellectuals use their work to both analyze the most important social issues of our time and agitate for social and political change. He is one of the leading scholars in Black intellectual history and is particularly attentive to the ways in which not only race, but also class, and we would add gender and sexuality debates are imbricated in Black social and political thought. He is professor of history, African American studies, and American studies at Yale University. He received his PhD in history from Yale in 1995, and it is a real testament to the quality of his scholarship and the esteem in which he is held that his PhD granting institution has hired him as a member of its faculty, a rare occurrence indeed, and in fact an honor. He is the author of such important books in our field as Confronting the Veil, Abram Davis Jr., E. Franklin Frazier, and Ralph Bunche, 1919 to 1941, the editor of Ralph Bunche's brief and tentative analysis of Negro leadership, and the co-editor of the anthology, Black Scholars on the Line, Race, Social Science, and American Thought in the 20th Century. He is currently working on the text, Jim Crow Wisdom, Memory and Identity in Black America since 1941. He is the recipient of numerous awards, a central figure in our field, but I have come to know him as an excellent colleague. As you know, our thoughts are with Elizabeth Alexander and her family during this occasion. And it was Jonathan who offered his support by agreeing to offer this lecture in her place. We thank him for that. We look forward to your remarks, and we welcome you to the podium. Jonathan Holloway.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Northwestern knows how to do introductions, doesn't it? That's lovely. Although I do come today with a heavy heart, I come happily and even joyfully. My thanks go, of course, to Celeste Watkins-Hayes for her generous introduction and her stewardship. They go to Dean Mangelsdorf and Provost Linzer for their abiding support of the Leon Forrest Lecture Series and African American Studies more broadly. And they go to my old friend, Associate Provost and Dean Dwight McBride. Dwight and I met in our first, are you about to walk out, Dwight? During my comments to you in this moment? You just, oh, all right. Yeah, okay. With friends like these, boy. I wrote this little part just for Dwight. I feel obliged to wait until he comes back. There he is. So Dwight and I met in our first year of graduate school, and our friendship blossomed as he let me crash on his couch every time I flew out to Los Angeles to work in the Ralph Bunche papers at UCLA. I look back with true fondness on those days as we sat around imagining our futures, thinking about our overlapping fields of interest, and of course pursuing graduate students' truest passion, academic gossip. Now, putting aside the fact of gossip for a moment, I learned a lot during those long discussions with Dwight and his ever-present circle of friends. As I look back, I find myself hoping that I was able to contribute in some fashion along the way. because he's an old friend and because I still feel indebted to those introductory thought pieces about work and the work of the scholar, the role of race, and the intersections between the two. When Dwight asked me last week if I would be willing to come and able to come today, I said yes as fast as I could. While I'm honestly not trying to settle up on old debts, it is my sincere wish that you might view this lecture as a contribution to a long-standing and deeply important exchange that travels beyond two friends and speaks to issues about which so many of us are deeply familiar. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. I start today's talk with Lucille Clifton's poem, Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. I start here because the poem is brilliant and speaks to the issues that are at the heart of my forthcoming book. And also, more importantly, because this poem summons Elizabeth Alexander. As you know, she's unable to be here today, but I like to think that whenever someone reads a poem that speaks to the heart of the African American experience, Elizabeth is in the room. Indeed, if it weren't for Elizabeth, I wouldn't have known about Lucille Clifton in the first place. She introduced me to her poetry and then introduced me to the poet herself. For those of you who know Elizabeth, you will recognize that this is the kind of thing at which she excels, putting ideas and people together with the faith that some compelling new thing will emerge from the interaction. In fact, Elizabeth's expertise in this sort of matchmaking helps me understand why she's such a towering figure in African American studies. An interdiscipline that relies upon scholars from different places and ideas from different contexts to come together in a shared project that is bigger than a single person or a single idea. I liken this larger project of African American studies to a conversation, one that was never easy to start, one that was never easy to sustain, but one that was always and remains important to have. Of course, difficult conversations may be clarifying in compelling and important ways, but they also come at a cost. It is this cost that is the heart of my talk today: the trauma of legitimacy, Black scholars, and memory in the age of Black studies. A Black student cannot merge into the university scene without consciously arriving to forget, a Black student cannot emerge into the university scene without constantly striving to forget his past, since the WASP dominance of that institution is of itself institutionalized racism, which assumes that more blatant and overt form in the actions of the campus security guards toward Black students. William Sales, Response to a Negro Negative, in the Columbia Daily Spectator, 1969. If our history has taught us anything, it is that action for change directed only against the external conditions of our oppressions is not enough. In order to be whole, we must recognize the despair oppression plants within each of us. That thin, persistent voice that says our efforts are useless. It will never change, so why bother? Accept it. Audre Lorde, Sister Outsider, 1984. My first tenure-track job was at the University of California, San Diego. I was in one of the most beautiful places in the country and in a first-rate department, but all wasn't perfect. I was only an acting assistant professor since I had yet to complete my dissertation. Although I was able to remove the acting tag from my title at the end of the first year, I began my professional academic career acutely aware of how tenuous things could be, and that I needed to be mindful of doing all the right things, publish a lot, teach effectively, be a good citizen, if I were to earn tenure down the line. In my third year on the faculty, I was leading a lecture course on Black politics in the 20th century. Things were going well enough. My lecture notes, a mad improvisation in the previous year, were coming together nicely, and I even had a teaching assistant. In truth, I actually didn't have a teaching assistant, just an undergraduate who seemed to think that she was helping me out by actively supporting my comments. It was still a small lecture course, and I'm not exaggerating, she could turn her chair around when she wanted, face the rest of the class, and underscore my points with her observations. Seems funny now, but it wasn't. Since I was still a new teacher and learning how to manage a course, I was trying to find a way to offer my unofficial assistant some gentle, corrective advice about her contributions. Coincidentally, just when I was about to engage her in that uncomfortable conversation, she started accompanying me after class as I walked to my department where I was about to hold office hours. We would talk the entire 15 minutes it took to cover the ground, going over topics from the course and beyond. And I had to admit, she knew the material extremely well. These exchanges continued another week or so until we had what turned out to be our final conversation. We'd arrived at the department, and I thought we were about to part company when she said that she had an observation that she wanted to share with me. I had no idea where this was going, but thought it would at least prove interesting, so I told her to go ahead. It turns out that her observation wasn't about my lectures, the books I selected for the course, or the mixture of exams and papers I assigned. Rather, it was about my appearance and my mannerisms. Apparently, my style of dress, in my opinion, pretty unremarkable, khakis and a long buttoned-down long-sleeve shirt, and my way of talking, proper English, made it seem like I was trying too hard to appear legitimate. That's a quote from her. I like to think that I'm fairly good at masking my emotions, but I was completely unprepared for her comment. I was so taken aback that instead of biting my tongue, an instinct that I had been carefully cultivating since my adolescence, I responded acidly, "I actually like these clothes. This is how I speak." And to be honest, I already thought I was legitimate. For the first time since she started taking my course, I saw a flicker of uncertainty flash across her face. She stammered a bit while saying, but Professor Holloway, you know what I mean, right? Before turning to head upstairs to my office, I offered a fully loaded and quick reply. Yes, I believe I do. I lost my assistant that afternoon. She continued with the course, and I'm sure she earned an A. But for lack of a better phrase, she kept her place from that moment on. Given her post-legitimacy behavior, I can only conclude she understood the fraught terrain she entered during our exchange. I also believe she understood that my acknowledgement of her intent was more complicated than it immediately seemed. I'd heard stories like this from my handful of grad school friends who were also in their first jobs. It didn't take long for me to realize that the only people who seemed to have these stories were my friends who were women or who belonged to an underrepresented minority group, or, of course, both. Even though I knew that I wasn't alone in this experience, the fact of the matter is my teaching assistant rattled me. While I put no special thought into what I wore or into how I spoke, I admit that I was burdened with a lingering anxiety about my job. Although I'm not sure if I ever wondered if I were legitimate or not, I certainly wondered if I would be an effective teacher. Also, like every other assistant professor, I worried about publishing enough. Finally, even though I loved my job, I was curious to learn if it would matter to my career as a historian that I did not have a, quote, straight history job, but was in the Department of Ethnic Studies instead. I had no doubt about the importance of ethnic studies, and I knew that it lined up well with my own personal, political, and intellectual interpretation of the United States narrative about its own past. Thinking about this country's popular memory and the way it has been fashioned around an erasure of the contributions made by people of color, not to mention women, poor people, political radicals, non-European immigrants, thinking about this narrative and its erasure made the work of ethnic studies that much more critical. I shared a conviction with my department colleagues that presenting a different narrative of the nation's past actually made the country a stronger, more vital, and certainly more honest place. Of course, my own declaration about the merits of ethnic studies would only travel as far as willing ears would listen. For those who weren't terribly concerned about the triumphalism in the American narrative, I expected a certain level of hesitance or confusion. The questions ranged from the relatively benign, what does ethnic studies mean, to the disappointing, can you still teach normal American history? When I received the latter question from an acquaintance who knew I specialized in the African American past and was someone with whom I felt I was building a cautious friendship, I shot back. The last time I checked, Black history is normal American history. Like my assistant would a few years later, my acquaintance stammered, come on, Jonathan, you know what I mean. And much like I would do at UCSD, I simply responded, yes, I know what you mean. In this case, I'm fairly certain that she missed the double-edged acknowledgement of her intent, that I knew she meant no real harm, and I believe that, but was completely unaware of how her question was overburdened with white privilege and amnesia. Or if just flat out ignorance. Let's not be kind in the moment. Even though my acquaintance didn't wonder out loud if I were legitimate, both of these instances reflect a larger crisis of legitimacy that is woven into the histories of Black scholars and Black studies more broadly. Just as teaching the history of the United States is about creating a narrative out of its long-held and forgotten pasts, Thinking about the history of Black scholars and Black studies invites a consideration of a broad set of memories: personal, traumatic memories of Jim Crow, professional memories of denied opportunities, and communal memories of the Black experience that manifest themselves into complicated feelings of racial obligation. Reading Legitimacy through these memories shows us that Black scholars' experiences and the disciplinary development of Black studies have been negotiated over the very charged questions of what could be known, who could know it, and who is allowed to bear witness. In this talk, I'll offer an abbreviated exploration of these issues, all the while wondering what it has meant to the individual when the legitimacy of that person and that person's past is questioned. Since so many Black scholars' access to the academy has been connected directly to the development of Black studies, these questions that I ask of the individual extend themselves into this particular field of study. What does it mean for a discipline when it grows out of traumatic memory? Legitimacy in history, or what can be known. These questions and issues were not yet on my mind during my freshman year at Stanford. Too concerned with navigating the typical transitional challenges from high school to college, I was only vaguely aware of the controversies surrounding law professor Derrick Bell, also in his first year at the university. Bell, who had been the first Black to earn tenure at Harvard's law school, had come to Stanford after serving as the dean of the University of Oregon School of Law. Bell was known for working at the vanguard of critical race theory, an approach to legal thinking that, among other things, pointed out the centrality of race in the construction of legal systems designed to benefit the wealthy and the powerful. Because Bell did not hesitate to link even the most basic concepts in his constitutional law course to the precepts of critical race theory, students began to complain that he was too political and narrow-minded in his approach to studying and teaching law. Dissatisfied students pointed out that because Bell put race at the center of his approach to constitutional law, they weren't actually learning the law's core concepts. Several professors supported the students, allowing them to audit their own law courses and then helping to organize, with the support of the dean of the law school, a series of public lectures on constitutional law. These lectures were open to the student body, but the poorly kept secret is that they were created in order to help compensate for Bell's perceived deficiencies. When the Black Law Student Association protested the first lecture, and pointed out the racist logics that drove the series, the law school canceled the lectures and the dean immediately apologized for his poor decision to support the remedial talks in the first place. Despite the fact that the lectures did not proceed, the episode was an abject lesson in humiliation, and even though Bell was known for being unflappable in the face of the abiding presence of racism, it is clear he was stung. In a personal reflection that was published immediately after the controversy, Bell did not hide his pain. I find myself remembering with feelings approaching fondness the occasional Southern judge who, to ensure that I did not miss his disdain for both my competence and my cause, swiveled his chair and faced the wall when I approached the bench to argue a civil rights case. Back then, the racial hostility was patent and the insult expected. By contrast, I accepted the invitation to visit Stanford as something of a reward for a decade and a half of proving myself worthy to teach at a prestigious school. As a guest welcomed with smiles at the door, I must confess that I simply was not prepared for what happened after I thought myself safe among friends. As a leading scholar of critical race theory, essentially Black studies in the nation's law schools, it was an unhappy irony that Bell found himself in embodied Exhibit A in a legal narrative about racial legitimacy. Legitimacy, relevance, and racial authenticity, or who can know. Decades before Bell's Stanford experience, universities had started to express a new desire for Black faculty in the wake of an upsurge in the numbers of Black undergraduates on historically white campuses. In a Ford Foundation report on the development of Black studies in the nation's colleges and universities, Harvard historian Nathan Huggins charted the dramatic growth in college enrollment as a result of the GI Bill and the post-war baby boom. Black college matriculation approached 10% of total student enrollment by the mid-1970s, and with this rise came pressure to addressing the needs and desires of this relatively new constituency. But Huggins made sure to add an important caveat to the received wisdom. Black students were not the only source of pressure to change the appearance and pedagogy of white universities. New visions of universities' ability to shape society and an increasing focus on career training prompted school administrators to rationalize departments' respective utility. Administrators now felt freer to ask, for example, the pragmatic value that a department of philosophy brought to a campus community. Merely contributing to the store of knowledge was being threatened by heightened devotion to particular knowledge's market value, to a particular knowledge's market value, or its potential for demonstrating social relevance. In this new environment, the social sciences and hard sciences, along with the professional schools, found it relatively easy to rationalize their existence and value to a campus and its students. Humanities programs and departments, on the other hand, faced a steeper challenge. That the humanities would lean in part on their ability to address social problems related to race as a basis to justify their value is ironic, since as a mode of inquiry, so many humanities programs had been criticized for their Eurocentric approach to culture, art, and thought. Whether it was true or not, Black students criticized humanities courses for failing to speak to the circumstances of their lives and traditions. Relevance, real or imagined, and in fact another way of wondering about legitimacy, was the catchword of the moment, and the either-or presumption dictated that one was part of the problem if one was not working toward a solution. The solution at many campuses was to hire 1 or 2 Black faculty and have them teach 1 or 2 courses on topics like Black literature or Black history. Typically, these courses were fully integrated into the standing curricular offerings, but this is only one solution. The more contentious path universities followed to fold Blackness into their curricula was the establishment of Black studies programs and departments. Related to the diverse means of which they became institutionalized on college campuses in the late 60s and early 70s, Black studies programs represented a range of political and theoretical approaches to the budding discipline. A few programs were methodologically traditional as far as the disciplinary questions they entertained by linking new Black studies programs to established humanities fields like English, history, and philosophy. Many more focused large aspects of their curricular agenda to constructing bridges between the campus and community. Still, other programs were explicitly race-first in their consciousness, determined to reserve Black studies for Black people. Disciplinarily traditional, community-oriented, and militantly political, these programs' modes and styles reflected that of the individuals who were hired to run them. But no matter where they happened to find an institutional home or how they defined it, Black studies programs and their teaching staff constantly lived on the edge of controversy. Figures like Nathan Hare often seemed to do what they could, either to seek out or provoke controversy. More than once, Hare declared that he thought Black studies, if done right, represented a vanguardist movement that could revolutionize the university and society. This was education in service of a larger political goal. To solve the problems of the Black race, Hare announced, Afro-American education must produce persons capable of solving the problems of a contagious American society. To solve the problems of American society, Afro-Americans must first blackwash, revamp, the existing educational system and revolutionize America's youth, Black, yellow, white, and brown. This blackwashing, in Hare's opinion, was the work of Black studies departments and the Black faculty who should staff them. Nathan Hare represented one end of the ideological spectrum when it came to Black studies and the discourse about race in higher education. Close to the other end, at least as far as Black studies were concerned, was social psychologist Kenneth Clark. At almost the same time that Hare offered his prescriptions of blackwashing, Clark was expressing his dismay that Antioch College administrators caved into Black student demands for a new Black studies program. A member of Antioch's Board of Trustees, Clark was angered that campus officials politically and financially supported the establishment of the Afro-American Institute and an undergraduate house that was racially exclusive. For someone who had staked his entire career on breaking down the barriers that preserve segregation, Antioch's decision violated Clark's principles. Clark responded to this violation by resigning from Antioch's board and issuing a public statement about the proper role of race in college campuses. The white liberal, for his part, who concedes Black separatism so hastily and benevolently, must look to his own reasons, not the least of them perhaps an exquisite relief. To encourage or endorse a separate Black program not academically equivalent to the college curriculum generally, indeed to endorse any such program, is to reinforce the Negro's inability to compete with whites for the real power of the real world. It is no excuse to justify the deed by citing the demand. Clark continued, colleges and universities must be the custodians of the rational and intellectual approach to the study and eventual solution of complex human problems. To succumb to any form of dogmatism, to institutionalize the irrational, is to fail in fulfilling this important obligation. Ironically, not quite a year before his resignation from Antioch, before he gave this statement, Clark gave a commencement address that acknowledged student anger and seemed to sympathize with, with their frustration with self-satisfied institutions of higher education. His language even evoked the traumas that fueled student rage. As I understand what the new breed of student rebels is saying beneath the incoherence of their frustration and bravado, it is that they are no longer able to accept the irrelevance, the isolation, the preoccupation with trivia, the indifference and insensitivity to flagrant injustices which pass for academic objectivity and are offered as higher education. Beneath the din and cacophony of the righteous indignation and police sirens with which they are answered, I think I hear these students saying that they demand, they are willing to sacrifice their own personal comfort and future for a morally relevant, personally fulfilling form of education. This commencement address, titled Learning from Students, was given at Antioch's 1968 commencement. Legitimacy and survival, or whose memories matter. It is evident that Clark was sympathetic to the black students who suffered at the hands of racist administrators, police, or security forces, and racist classmates. He was also sensitive to the fact that changes were coming fast and furious, his own resignation from the Antioch Board of Trustees less than a year later being a case in point. By the end of the decade and into the 1970s, black students were pressing for immediate change at colleges and universities across the country. The student protests at Northwestern, were fairly representative. A student sitting at the office of the university administration, accompanied by a set of demands, followed by a negotiated settlement. Among the students' 7 demands were calls for separate housing, the kind of request that Clark considered a step backward, a boost in the numbers of admitted blacks, and a policy statement by the university in which it openly deplored any form of racism. The demands themselves are revealing for the way that they point to student trauma. The opening lines of the document speak to this issue directly. We, the black students at Northwestern University, have found the academic, cultural, and social conditions for us on campus deplorably limited. In order to counteract the physical, emotional, and spiritual strains we have been subjugated to, in order to find some meaning and purpose in our being here, we demand the following conditions be immediately met. When the administration pushed back against the student demands, the students issued another final document in which they provided richer details about the sources of their anger and pain. Our experience in America has not been characterized by justice in any way. No white institution can right our hundreds of years of history and experience by suddenly treating us the same as white people and call it justice and equality. No matter how one looks at it, idealistically or realistically, black people know that we are still getting the short end of the deal. True to the times, students spoke with great passion about their ideals and sense of injustice. One of the most perceptive student activists on this issue had to be Armstead Robinson from Yale University. Robinson was a core member of the Black Student Alliance at Yale and was one of the 4 students who brought the case for black studies to the university's administration. Before he graduated from Yale, Robinson sat for an interview with the Yale Alumni magazine about his experiences of being black at Yale. Joined by 3 other student activists, Robinson's answers most powerfully captured the challenges of black life at Yale. Robinson sounded familiar notes of dissatisfaction and anger when he spoke about the whiteness of a place like Yale and the racial erasure of black history in the school's curriculum. However, when he addressed the foundational meaning of being black at Yale, Robinson sounded wise and weary beyond his years. He spoke to the role of the black individual in a virtually all-white setting and the fierce determination to preserve a set of memories and culture that would otherwise drown in an ocean of forgetfulness. And I quote at length, "The basic issue here is why we were brought to Yale in the first place. I will argue that somewhere deep in the minds of the people on the admissions committee was the idea that they needed some diversity. It's sort of like when you're cooking, you throw in some salt to make the food taste better. It's a fundamentally paternalistic conception, to assume that the functional utility of bringing black people here is to use them to broaden the horizons of white students. It almost seems as if Yale said, I'm quoting here, continuing, it almost seems as if Yale said, let's get some Indians, a few niggers, keep the number small, but have a few as spicing so you can have the whole pot taste good. I can't handle that. Not very many black people can handle it either. But some people might get the idea that talking this way implies that we're retreating into a certain negativism, that we're running away because we can't deal with it. That's not so. Our fundamental thing is a positive assertion. We refuse to be the spicing. We think there's much more to blackness than simply to make whiteness a little gray. We think that blackness in and of itself is good. We refuse to come here and lose our blackness by sort of helping out the white majority. In a sense, that would be asking a black student to come here and become deculturated. It's a hell of a process. And it's not something you ask anybody else to do. The desire for positive black identification is quite frankly a positive assertion that I have some identity that I intend to preserve. I'm not running away saying that I can't deal with it. It's just that if you don't ask anybody else to do it, then don't ask me to do it. For Robinson, preserving his blackness and all the memories and histories that came with it was nothing less than an act of survival. Other black students and scholars in the post-segregated university world wrestled with an overwhelming whiteness and, to an unsettling extent, used the language of survival in describing their experiences. These individuals had to endure literal physical resistance to their presence on campus. A college groundskeeper threw rocks at Robert Steptoe on his first day at campus. A band of white Dartmouth students pushed future literary scholar Charles T. Davis off the sidewalk, called him nigger, and spat on him. Individuals had to endure intellectual resistance to their presence on campus as well. A graduate school professor invited Bell Hooks to his office in order to tell her that he was personally committed to denying her a graduate degree. Individuals also had to endure the internalized pain of self-doubt, that they were doing the right thing for the black community. Was their work relevant? How did it serve the race? Did it tell the right stories? Black scholars have routinely wrestled with this last set of questions, wondering how they could rationalize their, quote, leisurely, and it ain't leisure, but their leisurely lifestyle when so many African Americans were in crisis. A guilt born of changing circumstance as well as a perceived failure to remain connected to the needs of Black America is a phenomenon that appears with frequency in Black scholars' recollections. When future professor of English Horace Porter secured a scholarship to Amherst and was thus able to leave a hardscrabble Southern life for the promises of life of the mind, he felt that he had won some sort of personal lottery. When he continued on to Yale for graduate school, and as his life became less recognizable to his family, he felt the pull of home in pernicious ways. Letters from an incarcerated brother pushed Porter to the breaking point as he struggled to reconcile his guilt with his own determination to follow his dreams. The only thing that helped him manage these emotions was the knowledge that he was not alone. Black students like me, he wrote, were suddenly being propelled at unprecedented speed to nominal social equality. We were flying into the middle class on the social and academic equivalent of the Concorde. Our survivor's guilt was inspired by the painful perception of the growing social and emotional distance between our own lives and the lives of our families, friends, and neighbors. At a different stage in his career, historian Claiborne Carson struggled with his own success in light of so many challenges that cut short other Black professors' careers. After a quick sprint through graduate school, Carson began teaching at Stanford University. He was part of the early 1970s wave of Black scholars being hired to diversify the nation's campuses and teach Black studies courses. Carson recalled that it was exciting to be part of what seemed to be a fundamental shift in the academy. But over time, the breadth and depth of that shift became less impressive and important. He writes, some of the younger Black professors who came to Stanford and to other universities during this period sacrificed their opportunity to gain tenure by devoting themselves to administrative and teaching responsibilities. I experienced a degree of survivor's guilt when I gained tenure. But I found it easy to immerse myself in historical research about my chosen subject matter and felt fortunate to be paid to follow my curiosity. Although I came to see my scholarly work as my most appropriate contribution to a still evolving freedom struggle, there were times when I longed for the activist role I had left behind. Part of Carson's guilt came from the fact that he succeeded where others did not. But he was also troubled because his success might have appeared to come at the expense of the Black community. Was he insufficiently dedicated to his students or to building a program in Black studies? Did he avoid the get your hands dirty work that his Black peers pursued, even if it meant giving up the chance to secure tenure? Was he still relevant? Was he, by extension, legitimate? Historian John Blassingame, one of Horace Porter's faculty mentors, certainly had an answer to these kinds of questions. When Porter confided to him confided in him that he was considering leaving graduate school to pursue a law degree, Blassingame immediately replied, "What about your responsibility to the black community?" Porter was unprepared for that question, but came to understand that for someone like Blassingame, the scholar's life was a worthy investment on behalf of the community, because educators, especially those working in black studies programs and departments, were building the curriculum for future generations. They are preserving and analyzing the cultural, political, social, and economic pasts that comprise the African American narrative. This was a task of fundamental importance. Because the language of guilt, trauma, and pain suffused so much of the discourse about the black experience on historically white campuses, and because this discourse accompanied a cry for relevance in the curriculum, critics of black studies came to see the discipline as an exercise in therapy and psychological recuperation. In 1969, Princeton economist W. Arthur Lewis, a future recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics and the first black to win a Nobel Prize in that field, wrote about his deep suspicions of black studies. The principal argument for forcing black students to spend a great deal of time in college studying African and Afro-American anthropology, history, languages, and literature, he wrote, is that they need such studies to overcome their racial inferiority complex. I'm not impressed by this argument. By the time children enter their mid-teens, he reasoned, the whites he meets, the books he reads, and the situation of the Negro in America all combine to persuade him that he is an inferior species of Homo sapiens. Stating that schools could not shape their students' fully formed personalities, Lewis concluded, to expect the colleges to eradicate the inferiority complexes of young black adults is to ask the impossible. And to expect this to come about by segregating black students in black studies under inferior teachers suggests some deficiency of thought. Reading past this economist's self-declared expertise in adolescent psychological development, Lewis's doubts about relevance and legitimacy are clear. He certainly did not want to see courses on the university ledger that were anything less than rigorous and recognizable to the most traditional notion of scholarship. In fact, the great majority of black studies scholars felt the same way, knowing they could not afford to appear as anything other than serious in their academic and pedagogic pursuits. Simply put, the stakes were too high. Their professional self-respect was on the line, and the future of black studies hung in the balance. Also, no one in the first generation of black studies scholars had any special training in black studies per se. When these scholars began to build the curriculum they were doing the work as historians, sociologists, literary scholars, philosophers, psychologists, and so on. Thinking about building a curriculum requires reflection about the breadth of that obligation. What has value? Whose voices matter? What memories do we preserve? At the core of these questions is the issue of legitimacy. As the first generation of black studies professors sought to declare the relevance of their research and pedagogy, early critiques of many of these efforts emerged among peer black studies scholars. We see this very clearly in Joyce Ladner's, Gloria Hull's, Patricia Bell Scott's, and Barbara Smith's pioneering books, The Death of White Sociology, Essays on Race and Culture, and All the Women Are White, All the Men Are Black, but Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women's Studies. These two anthologies are valuable for many reasons, but when it comes to thinking of them in terms of building the curriculum, they make very clear that so much of the call to the field, the call to a method, and the call to service were articulated in ways that erased the contributions or even the existence of black women. What we see in these collections is that the phenomenon of being left behind or forgotten is laced with trauma as well. Legitimacy and forgetfulness, or who can remember? Ladner's Death of White Sociology set out to address the ideological shifts that accompanied the changing face of American universities in the 1960s, the increasingly effective student protest for a racially inclusive pedagogy, and the recognition that the long-standing exclusion of the black experience in scholarly discourses was an injustice. Ladner was not forecasting the end of mainstream sociology, but she wanted to call attention to the fact that the sociological discourse that typically branded blacks as deviants would no longer go unchallenged. While The Death of White Sociology was a reactive text spurred on by the rising popularity of black deviance narratives through the 1960s, it also needs to be seen as a generative text. It was generating new narratives and thus new ways of remembering. In her own contribution to the anthology, Tomorrow's Tomorrow, The Black Woman, Ladner criticized mainstream sociology for looking at blacks as problems and called for new social science approaches that were significantly more introspective and sensitive to the structures of inequality instead of outlier behavior patterns. Ladner argued that there had to be, quote, a strong concern for redefining the problem. Instead of future studies being conducted on problems of the black community as represented by the deviant perspective, there must be a redefinition of the problem as being that of institutionalized racism. Ladner continued, studies which have as their focal point the alleged deviant attitudes and behavior of blacks are grounded within the racist assumptions and principles that only render blacks open to further exploitation. Ladner did not evoke Black Studies scholarship by name, but her critique of the state of current disciplinary practice was absolutely consistent with the collective sense among academics advocating for the establishment of Black Studies scholarship norms. This was an advocacy that recognized the humanity in blacks and the complexity of their experiences. This was also a scholarship that angrily denounced the idea that blacks were a people without a past. But as much as Ladner was in line with the guiding principles of Black Studies, she was different from the majority of Black Studies advocates in that she paid serious attention to the role of black women in the formation of a modern black identity. While The Death of White Sociology was clearly inspired as a reaction to the popularity of social science studies that viewed the matriarchal black family structure as pathological, Ladner's work also appeared at a moment of rising independent black feminist consciousness. Like The Death of White Sociology, But Some of Us Are Brave, is a work that is simultaneously reactive and generative. Hull, Scott, and Smith felt the need to act on behalf of generations of ignored black women scholars and black women's scholarship. Aside from the fact that But Some of Us Are Brave made an important contribution simply from the standpoint of including new voices in scholarly discourses, the book sheds valuable light on black studies for the way in which it offers an incisive critique of the formative impulses behind the discipline. Hull, Scott, and Smith enthusiastically embraced the new attention that blacks were receiving in lecture halls, seminars, journals, and books, but theirs was a qualified enthusiasm. Black men's blindness merged with white feminist racism that ignored or even disparaged black women's feminist consciousness in the early 1970s. As a result, black women's studies scholars were left with few opportunities in which to present work or to collaborate with like-minded academics. Hull and her co-editors urged their readers to combine the best aspects of feminist and black studies scholarships in order to fashion a black feminist movement that would, in turn, quote, lend its political strength to the development of black women's studies courses, programs, and research, and to the funding they require. This call for a structural shift in the work of the university echoed perfectly the call made just over a decade earlier by black studies advocates. When scholars like Gloria Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, Barbara Smith, and Joyce Ladner, and many others called attention to the need for black studies to be more expansive, they were arguing for a reassessment of black memory. Such memory would still be an experience rife with pain and discord, but remembering more honestly the active participants in forging that memory was a powerful and recuperative act. It was not the only recuperative work that had to be done, however. In February 2003, a conference on Black Studies was held at the Schomburg Center of Research in Black Culture. The purpose of the conference was to assess the state of black studies roughly 30 years after the field's establishment, and in light of the 2000 federal census report that showed Latinos had just passed black Americans as the nation's largest minority. Some participants voiced concern that the country's changing demographics suggested a looming crisis for black studies. Others were less worried, citing the centrality of slavery to the country's history and the tortured history of racialized struggles over citizenship since emancipation. Before the conference began, however, Howard Dotson ignited a controversy for his comments concerning the latest generation of black studies scholars. Dotson, then the director of the Schomburg, and one of the key figures in the history of the creation and institutionalization of black studies programs, declared that he was unhappy with the direction of the new black studies scholarship. He could not understand, for example, quote, the social utility of scholarship that studied black homosexuality, and felt that a quote, commitment and clear sense of direction seems to be missing from black studies scholarship in general. For those black studies scholars who worked in LGBTQ studies and who felt that they were working at the cutting edge of black studies scholarship, this comment was a slap in the face. It also amounted to a kind of intellectual policing that black studies scholars could anticipate from certain quarters in academia, but were less prepared to accept from within the black studies community. Further, Dodson's comments were a declaration of sorts that black queer studies scholars had forgotten their obligation. In a strange twist, a founder of black studies was feeling traumatized because this new generation of academics possessed a memory of the black experience that did not fall into line with his. Predating the State of Black Studies conference by 5 years, literary scholar Dwight McBride wrote insightfully about the politics of straight black authenticity and how it could silence alternative voices. McBride argued, there are any number of narratives that African American intellectuals employ to qualify themselves in the terms of race discourse to speak for the race. And while one routinely witnesses the use of narratives of racial discrimination, narratives of growing up poor and black and elevating oneself through education and hard work, we could scarcely imagine an instance in which narrating or even claiming one's gay or lesbian identity would authenticate or legitimate oneself as a racial representative. Although he didn't invoke memory literally, in writing about narratives and about race and poverty and uplift, McBride got to the core of so many challenges that have always weighed upon black scholars and students, and led to the calls for a curriculum that was relevant to the set of life experiences that white scholars had never bothered to consider in the first place. 5 years before McBride's astute observations were published, I was in graduate school, beginning to work in earnest on my dissertation, An Intellectual History of Black Radical Intellectuals in the New Deal Era. Facilitating my progress toward degree was the generous support I enjoyed from the Ford Foundation and the Danforth Foundation. The Ford Minority Predoctoral Fellowship and the Dorothy Danforth Compton Fellowship were designed to increase the number of underrepresented minority faculty on the nation's campuses by offering generous support for graduate school study and, importantly, to support annual conferences where fellows could present their work in progress and form networks that would serve them well in the future. That's how I met Dwight. At the turn of the century, and in the wake of third rail politics of affirmative action, the Ford Foundation changed the terms of its program so that the competition was open to anyone who could demonstrate a commitment to diversity in higher education. Since this change is so new, it remains unclear what the long-term effect on the nature of the program and the network of Ford Fellows will be. Things are much more clear when it comes to the Dorothy Danforth Compton Fellowship. More than a decade before Ford changed the terms of its support, the Danforth Foundation simply ended its program. I was sitting in the audience of what would turn out to be the final Danforth Compton annual meeting when a representative from the foundation announced the termination of the program because the foundation was going to turn its focus to supporting initiatives in elementary schools. It was hard to argue with the logic of the decision. Funding graduate students with the mission of diversifying the academy was at minimum a 20 to 30-year project with uncertain results. Supporting innovative programming in elementary schools had the potential for quicker return on investment and traceable results. Having said that, learning that a beloved program was being dismantled made everyone in the room feel like they had been punched in the gut. Tensions were high. Indeed, this is the only explanation I have for the interaction that I had later that evening with a fellow from Brown University who decided to challenge me on my racial legitimacy and my commitment to a program of supporting the diversification of the professoriate. There were 3 or 4 of us sitting around in a hotel room talking about the announcement from earlier in the day, wondering if the Danforth Foundation truly understood the importance of the fellowship and how long such a program took to bear fruit. We were talking from a place of pain when I suddenly became the focus of this individual's anger. He turned to me with questions that were as much accusations and prejudicial observation as anything else. What do you know about the challenges facing the black community? You have the privilege of being light-skinned, after all. What do you know about struggle? You look in sound middle class. My brother's in jail on drug charges. Given the fact that my inquisitor was tipsy, I probably should have dismissed the comments as some outward manifestation of unresolved private issues. But perhaps my own frustration with the foundation's decision had already exhausted my patience, and the last place I wanted to find myself was outcast from what I thought was a gathering of peers facing similar kinds of academic, professional, and even personal struggles. I should have ignored him, but I didn't. Essentially telling him to get out of my face and to refrain from lecturing me, I pointed out that I couldn't help my appearance and that I should not be asked to apologize for the circumstances in which I grew up. Also, I wasn't convinced that I was any less black than he because I didn't know anyone in jail. Finally, he ought to know that my grandfather was the first executive director of the United Negro College Fund and that my inquisitor should be grateful for his work. Immediately after these last words left my mouth, I felt miserable. Just as he played a race card against me, I played some sort of uplift meets race loyalty meets race royalty card against him. And to be honest, I knew that just as I wasn't responsible for my appearance or my class background, I had no right to take credit for the work that belonged to my grandfather. As for me, I really hadn't done anything yet to earn the righteous indignation I felt on the issue. I'm not entirely sure what happened next, but I do know that the conversation ended. I also know that I decided not to join the party that was forming next door. Most likely, I went back to my room, feeling very alone at a conference of over 100 underrepresented minority scholars, all of whom were, like me, pursuing the doctorate with the goal of becoming a professor and changing the face of the academy. I was not proud of my behavior that evening because I recognized that in my actions I had tried to make my pain and discomfort his. As I look back in that moment, we were both guilty of forgetting the traumas that described our emerging professional lives and truly, why we were even there in the first place. Battles over legitimacy are foundational to the history of Black studies. Black scholars in the field know at many levels, institutional, pedagogical, curricular, and personal, just how unpredictable these battles can be. Indeed, in the fog of war, it is not uncommon that we attack even our own best friends, all in an effort to declare, by God, I am legitimate. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for questions. We have about 15 minutes, and there's a microphone right in.
It's got to be an easy question.
Thank you so very much. That really was excellent, and especially if it's kind of the first time that you've put this together. So it was really great. My question is about the survivor's guilt that you talked about. And I'm wondering if you would categorize it as paralyzing without fruit. You use the word trauma, or is it an appropriate emotion to generate work, to generate activity? Or does the activity that is generated from survivor's guilt, is that not going to be the right activity for whatever we're working on, for our projects for social justice?
That's a great question, and I think it really depends on the person, because feelings of guilt are so embodied in different.
I'm listening. I'm gonna get you some water because I see you don't have any.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Actually,
Well, now I know that.
there we go.
I'm not going to drink out of this bottle, not like that. If there's a cup, I'd appreciate it. But your question is right on the money. That it's complicated to. I'm not going to generalize across survivor's guilt being embodied or experienced in the same kind of way, but it can be many things. It can be generative of a kind of scholarship that's really foundational to the Black Studies project or social justice project. It could be something that, thank you very much, that results in bitterness. I'm not going to talk about this stuff ever again. I cut out a large section of, an entire section of the chapter exploring an earlier history of J. Saunders Redding, who in his memoir declares, this is the last time I'm talking about these issues. Now, he would continue to talk about it, but he was so angry and bitter about the obligation the firsts always carried that he won't talk about this stuff anymore. When I was at Stanford 7 years ago on his fellowship, I met with Clay Carson, and we were talking about his early experiences. And he actually wrote a really great piece that was published in Souls, I can't remember the year, from which I quote. But in watching him talk about his experience getting the book published and going through tenure, watching the shifts in his body, it struck me like, wow, this is Clay Carson. This is 30 years ago, and he still is upset about this. He still feels betrayed by the colleagues in his department who bailed on him after, and it worked out, of course. So it can really be manifest in very different ways, and that's, it's not an elegant answer because it's not simple, but I think it matches the complexity of the human spirit in that way.
Thank you. I teach at Chicago State University now. I graduated from Northwestern's radio, TV, film doctoral program, and I'm there to teach African American cinema. And so I find the same kind of, like, which part to tell, which part not to tell, which part matters. And so in even coming up with the list of films to view, I'm just now going to get back to watching Paul Robeson. Because I was feeling I didn't know what to do with him in movies, and trying to come up with a narrative about, okay, well, we tell our stories this way, and this is our struggle, and so on. And so hearing you talk about this, like, okay, I'm in the right place because I'm uncomfortable. But at the same time, what am I generating for my students? Because I know the first time I taught it, it's like, this is making me mad.
Right, right.
And then we're like, what are we supposed to do? It just keeps happening. And so trying to figure out the balance of looking at the system and looking at what we do in our filmmaking and so on. So anything you could help me with?
I actually have a 5-point list of recommendations. No, I think this is our work. And it is a long race, and it will never be over. I think we have to reconcile ourselves to that fact. Okay. And I'm not even talking from a standpoint of social justice or feminism or whatever it is. Our work, and what I think is lovely and infuriating about it, is that it will never end. The hope is that it will, we need to keep coming with ideas, we need to keep working to understand this very complicated and changing world that has has depressing narratives that don't seem to ever change, but also does have narratives that do change. And we need to work to find all those things. And hopefully that's what keeps things interesting for us as teachers, and we can extend it to the students. Now, at its foundation, at fundamental level, though, it can be sobering when we're trying to talk about basics. Like, I teach the post-emancipation survey every spring. I love teaching this class. At some moment, inevitably in the term, I find it utterly horrifying to discover what the students don't know. And they're there eagerly. They're happy. They're really working hard. And then they'll ask a question in section, usually not in the lecture hall. I'm like, whoa, we need to. There are times when I feel like I'm going too far. I'm sorry. I don't want to be too basic, because like everybody knows this stuff.
Can't dumb it down. Right.
Turns out they don't. And so what is really important for us to accept is that we need to be working on two tracks at the same time. Keeping the basics on the plate so everybody can hopefully get to a place of shared understanding of things, and then being able to do more advanced work, more theoretical work to push the envelope even further. One last on this issue. In one of the years I was wondering, is this just too basic? A student wrote to me who never identified herself, never came up to me in person, it's done electronically as students do these days, and wrote to me a long email when we had just read The Fire Next Time, Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And I found this is a book, and many may have the same experience, when white students get freaked out. How could he be so angry, and all these different things. And the student who identified herself as white in the first line, I'm like, oh boy, here comes the angry white student. I need to, she's coming to me to feel better. She's a senior graduating in English, and she basically is writing a page-long email about how enraged she was that she didn't ever have Baldwin in an English class at Yale. I was like, wow, we do need to do the foundation work. Now, I'm happy to report English at Yale has changed dramatically in the last 3 years. It's only been 3. It's been 3 years, Jafari? 3 years, yeah. So Baldwin will be taught now, but it's easy to be lured into thinking we can push a lot faster and a lot further.
Right.
There's a foundation we got to keep in place.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I'm Milkar Shabazz, UMass Amherst, but I don't want to speak as a representative of UMass Amherst. I want to speak as a Milkar Shabazz. I first earned tenure in American Studies, and I appreciate that that's the way it played out, because it often gives me a way of looking at a lot of the discourses around Black studies or African American studies vis-a-vis my experiences with the development, the history, the narratives within American studies. And as with American studies, I think African American studies is a container that has a lot of room for black nationalism, room for black feminism, room for queer studies, room for concerns with legitimacy and doing therapy, through one's work. I think there's room for a lot of it. But what I really think we have to get concerned about is when we put black studies in a box. And I'm concerned when, for example, the story you relate with respect of Howard Dotson. I think that reflected Howard Dotson, and probably Howard Dotson at that moment. And I don't think it reflects black studies at that moment or black studies across time. And I think it's important to think of it that way. And again, coming from the American studies experience, because I think queering American studies has been a process in the same way that queering black studies is a process. And we must, above all, if we believe in black studies, continue to pull together through all these processes with all their difficulties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually agree with you more than you might be prepared to believe in Howard Dotson. I was struck, I cannot remember, there was an article about him going to the Moreland Spingarn to save that institution, the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. And I was struck, this is sometime in the last month or two, I can't remember when the article appeared. And he was very clear about this very broad and expansive agenda that is Black Studies agenda through this archive, and spoke directly to some aspect of LGBTQ scholarship. I can't remember the finer details now. And I was impressed that this was not the same person in terms of that kind of declaration of 9 or 10 years earlier. My point is actually not to pick on Howard Dotson, but to point to I remember very clearly the reaction of my peers who were working in this field and dismay as they went into the conference, that this was a statement that appeared in the Times maybe 2 days before the conference began. So I do, and maybe I might have to go back and think through a different way of phrasing, of narrating that particular moment, because I'm not trying to attack anybody, but I want to speak to that phenomenon that was very real and very palpable for quite a number of scholars. So thank you for that.
I just want to just as a note of history and context, because I wrote the panel that year for the sexuality panel at that conference. It was me, Kathy Cohen, Beth Ritchie, and Daryl Moore. And that article came out long after the panel had been submitted. So Dotson certainly was aware of the panel. And in fact, there was a behind-the-scenes exchange in which we got a lot of pushback from the program director because they changed the name of the panel. They took the word queer out of it. And I, of course, wrote back to them and said, well, this is not the name that we had suggested, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We went back and forth on the program. And then when we got to the conference, they had put us in a very small room. There was standing room only. They had to move us to a larger room because we were the only panel talking about sexual. People wanted to have the conversation. It was a very disturbing conversation, I will say that too. But one that needed to be had in the distance. So I don't know that I would say, I don't think it was just Howard. I sort of didn't take your comment.
No, it's not.
And I don't have anything personal against Howard either. I think Howard's done some incredibly important work. But I do believe that that was more than just a Howard thing. That was an African American studies thing. I don't want us to gloss over the fact that it has been very difficult for scholars who do work on sexuality to get a hearing in this field. And that is very new and something I think we all need to really be supportive of.
Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation tremendously, and
thank you.
Relate to many of the things that you said on a very personal level. I began my academic career in community college because I had had difficulty in high school where several of my academic instructors in critical fields like math and history dismissed my intellectual potential, and I had my own middle-class crisis because I like to work on cars, and I grew up in LA. And so I was an auto shop major in high school and not really prepared for four-year school. And when I entered the community college, it was really thankful to the Vietnam War that I realized that many of the whites that were not going to the war were able to get out on a student deferment. And so I got myself busy very quickly and made sure I had a B average, and I transferred to Temple University in 1970, where the very beginning of Black Studies was beginning. But I was I started as a business major, switched to communication, started studying linguistics, and as the field was burgeoning, I met a very famous professor at the University of Pennsylvania, William LeBeouf, who became my mentor and is the leading sociolinguist in the world. And where I grew up, I was told that you work with the best. And at that time, there were no Black PhDs in linguistics that were doing any work whatsoever. And in fact, I'm the first PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania who's African American. And so from there, I took a job at the University of Texas and was the first Black in the linguistics department there, where my student evaluation said that I was uppity and that I did not know my place. So I identify with your experience in that regard. I was very fortunate, though, because I worked my ass off. I got tenure after 4 years and went to the Center for Advanced Studies at Stanford, where I was then able to transfer to Stanford after a couple of years and spent most of my career there until 2005, when I directed African American Studies at Washington University, which has this program as an undergraduate institution. I wanted to share with you a hypothetical detail that's important to your experience with the Danforth Compton grant, because the Danforth family has been exceedingly helpful and generous to Washington University. You may note that the demise of the Danforth Compton Fellowship in the form that you remember it coincided very closely with Senator Danforth's run for office.
Oh, I remember it very well.
And those in the know hypothesize that their generosity to scholars of color, if it was widely known during his Senate run, was not necessarily the best way to raise funds in the Republican Party, yet elementary education would have that. So that backstory is a very critical piece. It's rumor, you know. I'm guilty of spreading rumor in a forum like this. But if you think about American politics and what would be said publicly and what's not said, I think a conference like this is one where sunlight helps. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Moses. I'm from the University of California in Santa Cruz. As you may or may not know, we've been engaged, well, since I started, and probably long before that, all the way through the 60s, but we've been engaged in a struggle for legitimacy as students, and it's very taxing on us, especially as an undergrads, to keep up with the capitalist nature of higher education, and being that we need to keep up with GRE scores, we need to apply and whatnot. But I was wondering if you could I'm an aspiring professor, I was wondering if you can give some advice to myself and to some of the other current professors in the room and some aspiring professors on how they can be there for students despite hypervisibility and being tokenized when things like blackface parties are happening on campus, or white students are putting cotton in front of Black student unions, as pranks, and then our realities and our articulation of institutionalized racism is being invalidated by administration and white community members who have no understanding of what we're going through. I mean, and what's complicating it in California especially is that although it's a struggle across communities, there's not very much solidarity across communities because there's this scramble for resources because of this capitalist buzzword of ethnic studies or diversity. So that complicates and it's starting to divide people, but I need closure before I become a professor, because I'm already hearing people talk about hypervisibility, then the grad students ain't getting enough sleep, and I need to know, I kind of need to know, I need to know what I'm getting myself into in a few short sentences, so maybe I could take it back to some of the people that are invalidating my reality as a Black student on a predominantly white campus with no faculty, Black faculty. Angela Davis is at Syracuse, and she's a celebrity, so what happens is
Hey,
when
well,
you
let
see
me
her
answer your
afro,
question. You can talk about Angela Davis
go
another
ahead.
time. So I do have some pieces of advice, and I want to, before I offer that though, I want to make clear this is my advice, and that you will find 10 different other paths at minimum that will a path to follow, advice for that in this room by itself. Okay. And so I recognize that there are many other ways to go, and some people might think I'm crazy about what I'm about to say, but it's something I believe, and this is the path I've decided to choose. It is very easy on any number of ways of imagining yourself as an aggrieved person. It's very easy to see the institution, your peers, your mentors, and whomever, as the people who are oppressing you. I'm not saying it's false or real. I'm just saying it's very easy to see that. What's the harder thing to do, and it's therefore easy to say, I'm checking out. I can't deal with this any longer. And I'm going to go by my own little, I'll get my degree, but I just can't do this. I'm just one person. The more challenging thing to do is to say, I refuse to abide by their presumptions of what I am. And I will, through hard work, and being sleepless, and it is not easy. And you will not get closure before you go to grad school. Let's just stop. That's a whole piece of education right there.
Thank you.
I believe that there is something to be accomplished by burrowing from within, by showing up, not to every single thing, but showing up in places where people don't know why you're there necessarily. And for an academic, that might be certainly as a black academic, as a black academic, I'll be called to come to a public forum about X, Y, or Z. But for me to show up to do basic committee work on a non-race issue, a non-sexy issue, to show up and be a good citizen, an active citizen, by being present, means you've changed the discourse in some small way. And by maintaining your presence, and being excellent, and I was writing a note to Dwight in frustration earlier that we have to be twice as good to get half as far, but recognizing that and say, well, that's just the way it is, and I shall now be twice as good. By proving yourself valuable and central to a community, you become valued and central to a community. And once you get to that place of power and privilege, the trick is don't forget how you got there and why you got there. That's the trick, of course. But so my path is to burrow from within and to become a person of some influence at my particular university. And I like to think that I am. And to not allow, in this case, black students who will come to me and talk about their frustration, like, I know you're frustrated, I'm frustrated too. But you cannot allow people to erase you, okay? Now, involvement can come in many different ways, on opinions that I might completely disagree with. But the fact is, I want to be democratic in seeing black students, in this case, find themselves throughout the university everywhere. In the Black Studies Center, absolutely. In the residential colleges at Yale, I want them to be prominent. In the Yale Daily, and the campus newspaper, and we all know campus newspapers act like idiots at different times.
Yes,
and it's very easy for blacks to say, I don't want to deal with that. My challenge is become an editor of that. Get involved in writing a regular column. Change the conversation in that particular space. It is really quite shocking how few people it takes in that kind of venue to make a real change. This is advice I got from one of my great mentors, Willie Brown at UC San Diego, a chemist who helped convene or was a faculty presence at the Campus Black Forum at UC San Diego. And there was just a few of us there. But every Friday we'd be there and we'd just be there to be for each other. And some students were complaining about the same kind of antics you experienced at UC San Diego. And he turned it around and said, how many of you have actually tried to get on the board or tried to write for the paper? No one raised their hand. How many of you have tried to do X, Y, and Z? And no one raised their hands. He goes, do that first, and then we continue the conversation. And that's old school advice. That's like, no sympathy kind of advice. But his point was really important.
Yes, thank you.
Is that you have got to, we are here because people did that for us. Suffered indignities that we can't really imagine. And I think we owe it to them. No matter what they look like, whatever race they happen to be or gender or whatever, we owe it to them to keep that fight going. And that fight can be manifested in many different ways. And my particular path, as I see it, is refusing to be shunted aside within the academic structure, the structures of my university communities, becoming centrally engaged. But I know it's not the only way. One other piece of advice, and this was given to me when I was, a year after college, I had a public policy fellowship in LA, and we were interviewing prominent public figures. And back then, Yvonne Braithwaite Burke, she was about to become a member of the Board of Supervisors for LA County, an incredibly powerful position. And someone asked her, because she had a long career of being the first black woman, the first black woman to do many things, said, Mrs. Burke, you've done all these things. You're a pioneer in all these ways. Do you feel that you've ever been used as a token? She goes, of course I've been a token, but I have never acted like one. I've never forgotten that. And that's my advice to students who want to, who are sick and tired of something and want to break through something that they can't break through. I'm like, well, break through it and remember why when you broke through, why you were there in the first place. Thank you.
Hi, Malaika McKee at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. I really appreciated your talk and specifically how you situated a good portion of your argument in kind of historical antecedents to say that the larger purposes of the university have changed over time, specifically highlighting the 1980s and 1990s with Alan Bloom on one side and Derrick Bell on the other and fighting quite terribly. I want to come forward to the present because, again, there are some kind of great schisms happening in the larger idea of the American university. Specifically, Gary Rhodes and Sheila Slaughter have given some great work about the role of academic capitalism in the university and the extent to which, again, the humanities are the focal point of this kind of larger discourse about the purpose of these social sciences and whether or not they are revenue generating and all of this kind of thing. To what degree do you believe that the trauma that we are experiencing in Black studies is attributable to some of our interaction with this larger problem of academic capitalism? And specifically, given that you are at Yale, which is an elite, and the majority of American universities are not elites, but wonderful land-grant institutions funded through the Morrill Act where they have very modest endowments and are dealing with at a very real level with the issues of academic capitalism and the outgrowth of the humanities. What advice would you give to those institutions struggling with those issues?
I wanted easy questions.
I'm sorry.
No, this is a tremendously important issue. And it does not matter if you are at a land-grant institution or an elite institution. This is something that I think is ripping or is getting at the heart of our institutions. I am, in some universities, history, which is my trained as a historian, I still identify as that first. In some places, it's a social science, but it's a soft social science. It's overwhelming. At Yale, it's a humanities discipline. And Yale was an institution that, for a long time, hundreds of years, prided itself on the strength of its humanities. It was kind of unusual. It was the last one to hold on to the idea of the humanities. And that moment is gone. And I say without any sense of drama, I'm brokenhearted about it. That the quest for, in the wake, in the collapse of the Cold War, the disappearance of federal dollars for funding research, and now the corporatization of the American Academy and corporations lining themselves neatly with departments of chemistry and biology and political scientists doing consultant work, what's left for the humanist? I wish I knew the answer. The only thing that I think that we have happens to be the most important thing, though. I think we are the soul of the university and the academic enterprise. Mm. And it's incumbent upon us to remind our administration that without us, what are you left with? It's so easy to not worry about different humanities programs. We are inexpensive, first of all, unless Dwight's running it, so that's a whole other issue. But we are, in the landscape of, where a lab at Yale cost $1 million for a new faculty. It cost $1 million to set up a lab for a new assistant professor. Well, okay, that's low. the research budget I was given that I was jumping for joy over was a pittance compared to this. We are inexpensive, but we take care of the most precious thing that universities have. And if our administrators become so technocratic and so bureaucratic and so in love with the bottom line beyond all else, we're all sunk. It's a short-term investment project where, I mean, short-term meaning 5-10 years, we're gonna get $1 billion from this great, spin-off. I mean, we need that money too. We absolutely do. The university needs it. But if it comes at the cost of forgetting why we are there, that we're trying to make better people for a really messed up world, and we make them better people by not teaching them just how to calibrate a certain kind of instrument or do a certain kind of stoichiometry, pull that out. We teach them about how to be mindful citizens, because we give them, and in my class, I give them a narrative about their own past. Like, we didn't know this. This is fundamental to what it means to be American, as far as I'm concerned. The history of the African American experience is at the center. By giving our students repeatedly these kinds of lessons in history, in philosophy, in English, in wherever in the humanities, and by getting the ear of our administrators, and then through them getting the ear of donors, frankly, who can be reminded very effectively of that great history class that changed the way they understood the world, that great English professor who inspired them to read the classics, although they go into world of finance. There's ways to make these connections, but we need to help administrators see that. And that is a lot of work. And aside from knowing that it's a lot of work and that it's hard, I don't know what else there is to say about it.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
you.